Can you guys still see the same screen?
Yes.
Yep.
All right, we'll give it one more second for some people to pile in. All right. Welcome, everyone. Really appreciate you guys taking the time to join today's webinar. During this session, we're going to be really focused on a growing and urgent challenge that I think we all can appreciate in the industry, and that's really the hidden drivers behind pharmacy costs. And we're going to give some solutions on how HR leaders and consultants can really take back control. So as we do some housekeeping items, first and foremost, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat throughout the webinar, and we'll answer them at the end of the Q&A. So my name is Brian Seeker, and I'm really excited to be today's moderator for the webinar. I serve as the EVP of Business Development here at Wellnecity. I've spent my entire career working across the employer benefits space, mostly at point solution vendors. So I've really seen firsthand how fragmented ecosystems can be. And that's really why I joined Wellnecity, because we solve that problem. We bring in all benefit stack data, medical RX, all vendor point solutions into one place so employers can actually see what's working, what's not, and where to act. But with that said, let's go ahead and jump in. I'm joined by two experts in the industry with deep experience in this space. If you want to introduce yourself, Marianne.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Marianne Carlisle, and I am the Chief Revenue Officer and Chief Operating Officer of ELMCRx Solutions. We are a clinical company focusing on managing specialty, high-cost medications, GLP-1s, non-specialty, and I run those operations and focus on strategic growth. Nice to be with you.
Nope, Jake, I think you're on mute.
Off to a great start. My name is Jake Steepleton. I am a group product manager here, mostly focused on partnering with employers on PBM contract analysis, RX program analysis, and really all things RX data.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both Jake and Marianne. So let's jump into it. I think, we all know pharmacy costs have quietly become one of the largest and fastest growing areas in the healthcare spend for a lot of these self-insured employers. But the issue isn't with just the price tag of the medications themselves. It's how difficult it is to see why the costs are rising or what you can actually do about it. So let's look at the landscape. Specialty drugs now make up just 2% of prescriptions, but account for nearly 60% of total pharmacy benefit costs. Secondly, US drug spending is expected to exceed $400 billion, with specialty drug costs projected to rise another 13.3% this year alone, which is putting a lot of pressure on employers and brokers on how to manage that overall cost. A major pressure point, I'm sure none of us on this webinar is surprised to hear, but GLP-1 medications like Ozempic and Wegovy, which are running about $12,000 to $16,000 per person annually. So even with active management, employers are spending more. And the reality is there's no clarity on where the money is actually going. And the real reason behind these cost drivers is often intentionally buried behind opaque pricing, the inability to understand PBM incentives and what's the actual compensation for drug manufacturers, et cetera, and the contract terms that quietly work against an employer's health plan. So really, that's what we're here to address. The reality is, though, it's not just about negotiating harder. It's about getting visibility and using it to make better decisions. So throughout today's webinar, we're going to cover a few key items, and that's Where hidden, or the reality is not so hidden, pharmacy costs show up, why rebate strategies often underperform, especially for mid-size or mid-tier employers, how to read between the lines of your PBM contract, and what actions you can take to protect your plan and your people. Today, you're going to hear real world stories from employers, real key proof points, and how they've uncovered issues, taken action, and recovered meaningful savings. You'll walk away, every single person, with key questions that I hope you ask really all of your PBM representatives. Contract terms that really deserve to take a second look, and a roadmap for smarter oversight and better outcomes. Marianne?
Thanks. Yeah, Brian, this is a great stat. Yes, less than 5% of the world's data, and certainly here, healthcare data, is used. And of the information that we analyze, probably 10% of it is actually used. In pharmacy benefits, that's a really important stat for us. Employers are flooded with reports. As everybody on this call knows, anybody who works with the PBMs, they're getting quarterly reports, semi-annual reports, but they're not seeing the cost drivers in those reports. So, and now with the new fiduciary obligations under the CAA rules, that's a risk no one can really afford to take.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary. And I think the problem isn't access to reports, it's the lack of insights and what to actually do with the data. Employers oftentimes get dashboards, but don't get the diagnostics, again, to take action. PBM summaries gloss over contract leakage. And the reality is without deeper visibility, pricing issues really, again, intentionally stay buried. And mid-sized employers are often left without the tools to really address this. So we're going to show exactly how to change that in our next slide. We've called this section, and I love this portion. It's what's inside the PBM black box. And that's intentionally named that way for this webinar, because frankly, that's how it feels really for most of our self-insured employers. In fact, according to a recent survey by Gallagher, over half of employers are already considering switching PBMs in the next year, and transparency is the #1 reason why. So with that said, let's break down what they're not seeing, right? And what's it really costing them? And so I'm probably going to go to you first, Marianne. What are some of the common cost drivers you see today in PBM contracts?
That's a great question. So lack of understanding about how the plan is performing for the benefit of the employer and the members. This is particularly true in the middle market, under 5,000 employees, under 5,000 members. The reporting is really very opaque, and it's definitely geared toward the showing how well the PBM is reporting. The contract provisions, the opaque claims reports, payment exceptions that people don't know about, and rebates are some of the other areas that are really leading, employers to a lack of understanding of how their plans are performing. There are a variety of revenue streams, as we all know. The PBMs generally charge more than they reimburse the pharmacies, and they're keeping the difference. So these are just a couple of the areas that are really not transparent and need to be made transparent through analytics.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marianne. Jake, you've probably seen how this plays out with the data. Can you share an example of where the numbers may have told a different story?
Yeah, so going back to Marianne's earlier point on the black box of payments around rebate guarantees, it's extremely important to be able to tag these guarantees at the claim level. So because we do this on behalf of our clients, we found many 6 and even 7-figure payment mistakes for our clients. So as one example of that, we had a situation where the vast majority of our clients' specialty claims actually fell under a different plan ID than the rest of their claims. When we got back the rebate reporting for Q1, we noticed a huge discrepancy on the specialty guarantee. Upon investigation into the claims data, we noticed that upon investigation into that claims data, that's where we noticed that those claims with the different plan ID were probably not being accounted for within that rebate report. So we'd sent that over to the PBM with our hypothesis that it was likely these claims that were not being included. And then within a week of receiving that, our client had gotten a payment back for that mistake. So that's something where we had caught that within just a couple months, where it was only a $200,000 mistake. But if that had gone on for the rest of the year, could have been $500,000, $600,000, $700,000. That was a delayed payment for our client. The other really important piece of that as well is being able to tag that at the claim level. So instead of us going to the PBM and just saying kind of something high level like, well, we think there might be a discrepancy here. Can you all take a second look at that? We're able to say, we think there's a specialty claim discrepancy, and we think there's 65 claims that we'd like you to review. So being able to be really specific like that was the key to getting that payment back for our client in a super timely manner.
Wow, wild. Thank you so much, Jake, for sharing that. So we've kind of, we've seen how the lack of transparency creates a black box regarding PBM contracts. But here's the thing, it's not the structure that's actually broken. It's also what's inside the spend itself. And the reality is drug costs are rising fast, but it's not just about the rebate issues where we're seeing, rebate issues individually that Jake may have shared, or specifically high dollar cost claimants. And the drug mix is shifting consistently. And without oversight, even standard meds can quietly drive six-figure leakage. So I'm going to go back to you, Marianne. What categories are you seeing really now that employers really need to watch?
That's a great point, Ryan. Yeah. So 5 years ago, the top 10 medications were in any plan were almost all specialty medications. But today we're seeing a real variation. In addition to GLP-1s and high-cost non-specialty medications, there's been tremendous growth in migraine medications. So you have this whole new class of medications. You've got GLP-1s, you've got migraine medications, you've got specialty, all kind of now in the mix for your top 10 medications. So Nurtec, Ubrevely, autoimmune medications, especially where biosimilars exist for Humira, we're all familiar with. Stelara has hit. Actemra has a biosimilar now. The oncology medications. And this list will change in the next 12 to 24 months. That's why you cannot have a static strategy. It's critical to understand not just what's being prescribed, but how these medications are being sourced.
Yeah, Marianne, I like the point about biosimilars. I think this is, in my experience, one of the biggest missed opportunities, especially for consultants, employers. From your perspective, what needs to be in place for an employer to actually realize those savings?
So although we are missing, some opportunity, thankfully, we're sort of just at the beginning of this biosimilar curve, right? So a couple of things to keep in mind. The formulary design and composition is critical. The formulary has to be structured to favor and allow prescribing of biosimilars. The provider network has to be engaged. The providers aren't just going to write a script for a biosimilar. It's critical that whomever the clinical team is that's working with prescribers are getting in touch with them and talking to them about these prescribers. And then contract terms, we touched on this briefly, but it has to give the employer the flexibility to take advantage of the biosimilars and not just these sort of shadow priced biosimilars. That's something that's really important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marianne. Jake, we'll put you on the spot right now. Let's go back to some real world examples. Do you have maybe an example you can share where biosimilar savings opportunities and what it looked like in practice?
Yeah. So we worked with a very large employer where the biosimilars for Humira were technically available on their plan, but the utilization of these was essentially zero. After we showed them a true net cost analysis of the biosimilar versus the other product they have on the formulary, they were really interested in exploring different options to be able to increase the utilization of the biosimilar. So this led to them implementing a step therapy approach, which is obviously going to enable a more cost-effective setup. When we then went back to track the performance of how this was doing, one thing that we noticed that it was really important to track was not only that people on Humira were transitioning successfully to the biosimilar, but also that new utilizers in the drug class were going to the biosimilar first, as opposed to going to other expensive drugs in the same class. So Humira utilization might fall and everybody wants to have a big celebration, but if the people who are going to be on Humira are now on a more expensive drug like Skyrizi, then your net cost at the end of the day might actually be worse.
Yeah, I think that, and that brings us probably to the most important aspect, and that's the need for ongoing oversight. How often should employers really be reviewing kind of PBM performance? Marianne, maybe some aspects from you?
Sure. I think Jake just gave us an excellent example because first you have to do the initial analysis to see what's going on. You diagnosed that there was no biosimilar acceptance among the group, but then you have to go back and monitor. So that this kind of claims monitoring needs to be continuous. Ongoing monitoring on a strong platform like the Wellnecity platform, because every report you get from the PBM or your healthcare carrier is going to be designed to reinforce that vendor's performance. Independence and analytics is critical for anybody to understand and then continue to understand what's happening under their program.
Yeah, and for that specific example, it's obviously very important for that employer. If they implement that step therapy program on January 1st, they want to know by January 30th, how is that performing? What percentage of people have switched over? What is our cost on Humira versus the biosimilar? That way, if the program is not performing as expected for some reason, then they're able to take action after just 1 month instead of waiting for maybe a Q1 report that's not delivered until June to find out that it's not performing like they expected.
Agreed. I think that's super important. And it really shows the need to use tools that highlight misguarantees, off formulary use, or sudden price shifts. So we've talked a little bit about the drugs themselves and how sourcing, formulary, and contract design can either unlock savings or rather block them. But there's another trap that I think we inherently have to talk about, and that's the rebate game. On the surface, rebate totals can really look impressive, but the reality and the truth is that high rebates often are hiding high drug list prices. Marianne, let's talk about how employers should be thinking differently when they think about rebates or negotiating their rebates, and what really matters when it comes to net cost.
So that's a great question, Ryan. So for a long time, rebates were a very good tool, but they seem to have outlived their usefulness now. And we're seeing that there is a migration to looking at lowest net cost versus lowest net formulary cost. So I think one of the first steps that people may want to take is a comparison of lowest net cost versus lowest net formulary cost. Do the financial analysis. Then there needs to be a good platform where you can, when you make that determination of whether you're going to drive to lowest net cost or lowest net formulary cost, you need a good platform to monitor how that is working for you. These high rebates can hide the high list prices of these medications. If you focus on lowest net cost, request 100% pass through on your contracts, and don't let the rebate guarantees override value, that should have real impact on the plan. When we've seen clients modeling lowest net cost versus lowest net formulary strategies, they often seem to come to the conclusion that the lowest net cost can be the best for their plan. We're starting to see labor and municipalities move in this direction. So although rebates can really be impactful, you need to do the math to see what's going to be best for your client. Another really important point about looking at lowest net cost versus lowest net rebate cost is that, there's now a fiduciary obligation on the employer to make sure that the funds that they take from employees in the form of contributions to the plan are used wisely and prudently. This prudent standard is really very important. So with 30 to 50% of the contributions going to the healthcare cost premiums, it is really important for employers to look at this and be able to document that they perform this. So.
Yeah, and that rebate first mindset, I often see that that's the default for most employers. I think there was a recent survey that found that 62.7% of employers have rebate guarantees specifically for specialty drugs, which just shows how much weight is still being placed in the wrong metric. But those guarantees often really come with, inflated list pricing. And without audit rights or net cost tracking, it's nearly impossible to know what you're really paying for.
Very true. Very true. Again, the key is having the analytics to make the comparisons of the performance here. It's so critical for the plan, for the employers, and knowledge is power, right? And you're not going to get that knowledge from the PBM.
Yeah. So let's maybe get specific. Contract language often sounds fine on the surface, but one small clause can really have a major financial impact.
That's absolutely true. Terms around specialty medication sourcing, rebate definitions, and guarantees may seem minor, but that is where leakage happens. I come from a PBM consulting background, even though I'm in the services area now, and we literally saw the difference between an of and an or in a PBM contract cost a client $1 million. So it is really critical.
Yeah, and you might think just because of the specialty guarantees and how high they are, then the more drugs you have in that bucket, the better it's going to be for you. But we've seen time and time again that that is really not the case, especially with one bucket. So we've seen a lot of cases where low-cost generic drugs are being classified as specialty, and this is allowing the PBM per the contract to add 100x spread and even higher on some of these claims. So we've seen drugs that are $50 end up being billed for $5,000, $10,000, even up to $15,000. And then additionally, there's also chances where if your contract allows for offsetting, then what you might end up seeing as well is six-figure underperformance and maybe your brand or your generic channel being offset by an overperformance in your specialty channel just because of the classification of maybe one really low-cost drug that is leading to a really inflated AWP discount that is kind of making your specialty discount look significantly better than it really is. So that's the sort of stuff where if you aren't able to look at each contract term and know how to actually track that in your data, then that's the sort of stuff that just flies right by.
Absolutely. I like that, continually monitoring from a financial and vendor controls of contract terms. Thank you so much. Let's shift again into a space that's often overlooked, but what I've also seen is it can be financially massive, and that's infusion management. Jake, can you walk us through what this may look like in kind of a real world example?
Yeah. So it's important to note that to be able to fully analyze drug spend on your plan, it's not only important to plug into the RX claims, but you need to be plugged into the med claims as well, because a lot of high cost infusions are actually going to flow through the TPA. So we monitor these for potential site of care transitions all the time. And these are just two examples where we found a lot of savings. So in one case, we had a patient who was getting the drug Ocrevus at an outpatient hospital setting every 6 months, paying about $55,000 for that. And we flagged that as a potential transition, knowing that normally this drug is about $30,000 to $35,000. That patient was then transferred to their own home for the next infusion, and the cost on that medication went down to $33,000. So that's $44,000 saved annually on one patient with a very kind of simple transition there as well. On the right side is another example where this patient was actually getting decent pricing at I believe it was an office setting. They then moved and transitioned to a hospital setting in their new location, which led to about double the price that this infusion should be. So we had flagged after that transition and also got that patient transferred to a home infusion as well. So about $7,500 savings per infusion, 6 infusions a year. That's another $45,000 saved. And this is an important one to note as well, because not only are we getting the patient to a more cost-effective site of care, but usually the patient experience in a home or an infusion center is going to be significantly better than having to drive down to the hospital, pay for parking in the garage, and then find the room somewhere in the building. So it's kind of a win-win on both sides.
Absolutely.
That's a great point. So this is a very hot topic. I was just at the SCIA Cell and Gene Therapy Conference a couple of weeks ago, and there was a full day devoted to this. Site of care is a very, very important topic. It's not just, what's being infused, it's where it's being infused. And the only way for you to understand what's happening is to do the diagnostics. You need to look at the claims. You need to go down to the claims level, and then you need to implement a good team. This just doesn't get shifted without intervention, right? So then you need to intervene and make sure it shifts. So everything hangs on the diagnostics piece of this, though.
Yeah, I think that again, though, it's really why visibility or ongoing visibility matters so much. It's not just enough to negotiate on a unit price perspective. You really need to see where care is and like where it's delivered and really avoid those silent, overcharges. I'm going to go to the next slide. What should employers and consultants be doing today from your perspective? I'm going to turn it over to you, Marianne, first.
Sure, thank you. So, I mean, there are a lot of things we need to think about as employers, consultants, and service providers. But some of the key questions to ask, are rebates fully transparent? Are they being passed through? And can you tag them down to the claims level? That's the only way to do a really good analysis and understand. Um, can you audit? Can the plan audit its performance guarantees? Also critical, also really need a great platform to help you with that. Do we have visibility into specialty sourcing and tier placement? Pay attention to your formularies, where are your medications being sourced? Do you have any opportunity to source those medications? Are you in a single source contract? And close attention is really being paid now to that fiduciary responsibility. Are you managing those high cost medications? Are you looking at biosimilars? Are you paying attention to what the formulary opportunities are? Are you using those contributions prudently and wisely? Those would be my couple of key takeaways.
And
Awesome.
just
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, just to add a few more there, like first and foremost, do you have access to clean, timely data? Without that, then the rest is really hard to accomplish. Are you able to use that data to independently validate the performance of your plan, or are you just taking the vendor's word for it via the performance reports you're getting from them? Are you able to take your data, do a benchmark analysis across conditions and providers? And then finally, are you kind of building the muscle to do the governance into every single quarter and not just as like an annual exercise?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jake and Marianne. So that kind of brings us to our closing and question and answers. As we wrap up, I want really three big takeaways before we take audience questions. And that's one, the hidden cost drivers are real and quite frankly avoidable. As long as you have that visibility in contract alignment, employers can really cut significant waste. Two, oversight must be ongoing, right? Not just stagnant reports. And three, that ongoing reporting functionality really needs to transform into real-time alerts and accountabilities for must-have interventions that are timely. So I'm going to pull up some of the questions. Feel free to jump in if we have any. Oh, it looks like I've got one right here. So this one I'm probably going to direct over to Marianne. When you think of your formulary, how can you change your formulary contract?
So, all of this really starts, I believe, with the PBM contract negotiations. Unfortunately, PBMs make it a little bit more difficult for those of us on this call who operate in the middle market. But what you can do is arm yourself with the list of biosimilars and low-cost alternatives to some of the high-cost medications. And when you start that negotiation, or you're meeting with your client, or you're meeting with your PBM representatives, talk to them about this and ask them the position on the formulary, and do they have formularies that support this?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marianne. Looks like we've got another question over here. It says, in our pursuit of payment integrity, how can we better align incentives across PBMs, providers, and employers to avoid overpaying for drugs that deliver little to no clinical value? I'll take maybe a first stab at that one. Marianne and Jake, keep me honest. But quite frankly, I think a lot of the fiduciary lawsuits that we're seeing with some major Fortune 50 companies, and the reality, a lot of those are focused just around, prescription and PBM costs. And so I think inherently we're starting to see more aligned incentives just organically coming out of that. And there's this overwhelming need to just really dive in and pull open that black box.
Yeah, I would say just to kind of drive home the point on the importance of data in a conversation like that is it's really hard to start that conversation and kind of understand how your incentives are, or kind of how start the conversation with your PBM and your advisors if you can't really point to the specific drugs that are the problem child for your plan. So every single kind of drug that was named in the different fiduciary responsibility lawsuits, being able to kind of take those, go back to your plan, understand, is this a potential problem that we're having, so that you have the claims information and the drug information as a starting place for those conversations.
And I'll just add there one final point. Once you've done the analysis, once you see what's going on, once you're looking at these medications, get some good clinical support. If you have a good PBM, they should be able to offer you that good clinical support. If not, then, certainly see what you can do to get in touch with some really talented pharmacists. There are many of them around who can help you do some of that analysis once you've, the clinical piece to that data analysis piece.
Thank you. Well, thank you to my fabulous co-hosts here, Marianne and Jake. But to the audience, really, I'd like to say if you're wondering where your plan sits today, what's working, what's leaking, and what's hiding, my biggest advice to you is don't guess. Wellnecity, ELMC, we're going to be really excited to offer to participants on this panel a chance to run, a free analysis to see where we may be able to implement different levers and where the different keys to success that can be implemented. So I would say feel free to reach out, either scan the QR code or shoot an email over to demo@wellnecity.com. And also for everyone on the call, we are going to send a tip sheet with some simple steps that you can kind of take away and hopefully work in your favor. So thank you so much to everyone that made the time to attend, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.